My name's Debra Medina. I'm a candidate for Texas State Comptroller. I've been active and engaged in grassroots conservative politics for probably close to 20 years, and had a kind of an enlightening moment when the Republicans finally regained control of the Texas House. I'd been working in the grassroots activism, being told by the party leadership that we needed to grow the party. We weren't going to get the sorts of limited government that we wanted until we had a majority in the Texas House. We got the majority in the Texas House, and the first thing they did was propose multi-billion-dollar increases to public ed spending, and I just kind of went berserk and got pretty frustrated with the state party leadership. At the time, I was in county party leadership. And it occurred to me that if I was expecting the state party to be a better watchdog over what was happening in the Texas legislature, it's probably my responsibility at the county level to be looking at my own local government, and really kind of moved beyond just listening to my local elected leaders stand up in front of the Rotary Club or the Chamber of Commerce and tell us how great things were. Started getting into the books and looking to see whether or not what I was being told really lined up with what was in the books, and began through that process to get a pretty intimate knowledge of the comprehensive annual financial reports that all of the various government entities in Texas file every year. It keeps track of what the fiscal situation of that entity is. My background was in healthcare, and I'd been a manager, a nurse manager in that arena for a number of years. I have a business degree in addition to a nursing degree, and so when I first started looking at those results, I thought I must be misreading this, because if I'm looking at these numbers right, we got a problem. And I called an expert in municipal finance audit, and he said, "Oh honey, you got this. You don't have any trouble understanding what you're seeing." And that really kind of started for me, I think, this recognition that we have to not only kind of ask our candidates questions, but we've got to, one of our presidents said, right, trust but verify what we're seeing. And I began to do that, and have had a lot of focus on government fiscal responsibility at the local level, but also at the state level. And many that see this video will know me first from the governor's race from 4 years ago, and how much that dialogue changed as a result of us kind of shining a spotlight on the fiscal issues. So when I look at how do I continue to advance the ideas that I feel so strongly about, being able to be in the comptroller's office, being able to sit in the agency that really is responsible for the fiscal management of the state and for giving information to the public and to the legislature about what that condition is, it is a very good fit for the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to run the race and to continue to work with the people of Texas.
Comptroller collects more than 60 types of taxes, fees.
Right.
It's pretty complicated on some of them. As comptroller, how can your office make filing and paperwork easier for businesses?
You know, I mentioned that I'm a registered nurse by profession. Healthcare is a highly regulated industry, and I learned very early on as a nurse manager that dealing with regulators is kind of an art, and the importance of having regulators who understand the statute, but then also having agencies that set very clear guidelines about how that statute is going to be enforced. And what I'm hearing from businesses all over the state of Texas is that that's an area that really needs some improvement in the comptroller's office. The agency has not been willing or able to give clear guidelines about how the various statutes that are on the books are going to be interpreted and enforced. And even when you get some guidance, there seems to be very great variability in how that's implemented practically. So I think we have to bring some of those real free market, private sector initiatives into a very large agency here in the state of Texas. Certainly healthcare is an area, my background there in corporate for-profit healthcare, delivering high-quality service, efficient service with very limited budgets is going to be an asset to this agency. I had to do it there because people's lives depended on it. Well, the life of our state, our fiscal health and our viability and our prosperity depend on us being better managers of our fiscal resources. So I'm going to look at doing that better, but also I think it's important to talk about we need major reform in our tax. 63 plus state taxes in Texas is too many.
You've proposed in the past replacing property taxes with
Right.
a higher sales tax, basically a fair tax for Texas. How can the Comptroller's office influence such a change, since this would require legislative action?
The Comptroller's office sends representatives to each committee within the legislature that deals with fiscal issues. What we've seen recently is that those staffers comment very specifically and very narrowly on the impact of various proposals. How much revenue will they generate? How great of a credit dollar-wise has it been given, in a very static sort of an analysis. What we've seen in the past, and what I think we've got to return to, and it's risky and it's difficult, is a more dynamic assessment. So you need a comptroller who's going to come to the table with the legislature, who's backed up by the expertise of a large agency, who's going to be able to share with the legislators who are inundated with hundreds, literally thousands of bills every session that they have to review. We need the expertise of the Comptroller's office coming to the table and talking about the effect of tax policy in Texas and weighing in with some opinion and some evaluation about what does this policy do. Does it drive free markets? Does it drive us towards greater freedom in the markets, or does it pick winners and losers? The crony capitalism that we've talked about, that our state is so prevalent with, we've got to get away from that, and I'm going to continue to advocate for major tax reform, because I believe our tax system is riddled with policies that do pick winners and losers, that do create that crony capitalist sort of environment, rather than a true free market which provides the greatest opportunity for prosperity for the most people.
On the issue of crony capitalism, the Comptroller's office is responsible for awarding government contracts to businesses. How will you deal with the problem of quid pro quo, where contracts are awarded for contributions or vice versa in your office?
Well, I think there's certainly lots of opportunity to look at that process, but I believe when we talk about crony capitalism, it's more than just the direct awarding of these contracts. It's really the structure of our law, where we have created exemptions for certain businesses, where we've given credits to certain industries to try to stimulate, if you will, that particular industry. We've set up economic development funds in the state. Those are nothing but investment funds, and I don't believe it's the role of government to be in the investment banking business. It's the private sector that will best identify the sorts of businesses that we ought to be investing in here in Texas, and those businesses need to prosper or fail on their own merits, not because they've been underwritten by dollars forcibly taken out of the pockets of Texas taxpayers. If you earn the money and you want to invest in that new idea, that new business, then you ought to be able to do that. So I think when we talk about crony capitalism, it's a whole lot bigger than just which company's got a particular government contract. It's really the essence of that is, how have we written our law so that we no longer have a level playing field, where the government is there to just make sure contracts are honored and rights are not violated, but it's also been kind of setting up certain businesses attempting to ensure they're thriving, and that may not be the best thing for the economy.
Do you think there is a problem between the awarding of contracts and the political relationships those businesses have with certain elected officials, as you know, they're, like I said, quid pro quo, where either A, the contribution came before the campaign contribution came before the contract, or the contract came before the campaign contribution. Do you think that is a problem you will have to face?
I think there's no question that we find ourselves in an environment where that practice is very prevalent. It's one that's developed over a long period of time. It's not a brand new problem, and so we really need to, as political leaders and as people who engage in public policy debate, we really need to, I think, deliberate over how do you resolve that. Anybody at any social gathering would say, oh yeah, we don't want that to happen. But if you show up at the legislature, you'll see many of those same people that say, oh yeah, we don't want that to happen, and they're asking for their share of that pie, their slice of that pie. So I think we have to get a little bit more honest in our discussion about what crony capitalism means, how it hurts us in the long run, and more importantly, how do we begin to turn that back so that we get to level playing fields, equal opportunity with no guarantee of equal outcome.
Worst case scenario for many Republicans is a Democrat victory for the governor and lieutenant governor's office. If such an event would occur and you're the comptroller, how as a Republican would you work with them?
Well, you know, I don't believe for a second if we put together the right ticket in Texas, a good strong Republican conservative ticket in Texas, that we're going to see that eventuality. I have been sharing around the state that I believe this candidacy in particular, my candidacy in particular, is very important for the Republican ticket in November 2014. We have clearly Battleground Texas coming with a very aggressive push to make that happen. The Democrats have a very attractive candidate at the top of their ticket. I've demonstrated an ability, on the contrary, on the other hand, I've demonstrated an ability to energize a base, nearly 20% of the vote against two political titans in Texas, because we're able to energize a base, because I speak on ideas that resonate with people. I have appealed to not just rank and file Republicans, but to the Liberty Movement and the Tea Party movement, and to the 30+% of Texans who consider themselves to be independent. So it's important to, I think, to make sure that we have people on our ticket in November of 2014 that can appeal to all of those sectors. But beyond that, I've already been working across the aisle. You've seen me out active for the last several years on this common carrier pipeline eminent domain issue, where there have been groups from the left, groups from the center, and groups from the right who have all been concerned about how we protect private property in Texas. It's been great to work with them. I think I've really been doing that all my life. So being able to work with people who have a different set of ideas, it's not something that is distasteful, I think, in any way, and maybe make us all a little bit better at our game.
Part of your job will be working with House leadership, and many conservatives and Tea Party groups are concerned that it's too liberal and needs to change in order for true fiscal restraint to be attained. Do you agree with this sentiment?
I've weighed in back in 2011 when I think we were at maybe the pinnacle of the debate about the leadership of the Texas House, on how important it is that we really look at what the role of the leader of a deliberative body is. In fact, I weighed in a pretty major way about the leadership of the Republican Party in 2008. I believe that our leadership was depriving individuals of the ability to participate in and have that discussion. I'm going to continue to talk about how important a deliberative assembly is. I believe that we find wisdom when men and women come together and discuss ideas. So we've got to make sure that we have leadership that's not just somebody in place to cheat for our side, but somebody who's really going to stand up and make sure that all of the voices are heard. 150 members of the Texas House were all duly elected representatives from their various areas of Texas. Their ideas deserve a hearing, and then the body should be voting, and the majority sentiment should prevail. So yes, I think we've got a problem. I talked about that in late September. Speaker Strauss has said repeatedly that he is going to work to ensure that the will of the members of the House is affected in the legislation that comes through that House. In the last session, I don't think there's any question that the will of the members of the House was decidedly pro-gun. And yet we got no gun legislation out of the Texas House in the last session. So clearly we have a problem with implementing that idea. We can all stand up and talk about these noble ideas about making sure the will of the people is done, but unless we really understand the role of a chairman's first priority is not to push policy. Their first job, the chair's job, is to make sure that there's a fair process, that we set up a set of rules that will enable and facilitate that debate, and then that debate is transparent. I've got a real problem with the Calendars Committee in the Texas House. It is crafted, in my view, by the members of the House so that they can sit on these publicly videotaped committees and do one thing, and go behind the very thick, dark curtain that surrounds the Calendars Committee and do the exact opposite and say to their constituents, we have no idea why that bill couldn't go through. So we really need to press not just the Speaker, but all the members of the Texas House to make sure that when they write their own rules, when they write the supplemental rules for how the Texas House is going to operate, they write those rules in a way that ensure a fair, transparent process so that we get good legislation from the Texas House.
Some say Texas is facing a local debt crisis. We're second in the country in municipal debt and first in school district debt. Susan Combs started a program, Texas Transparency, to raise awareness of this problem. Will you continue this program, and if so, will you expand it in any way?
Her transparency efforts, I think everybody in this race and beyond is applauding those transparency efforts, but as someone who gets in and needs that data, a lot of data is like drinking from a fire hydrant, right? We've got to do a little bit more with that information to make sure that we just don't put volumes of data out there, but that we organize it in a way and that we help present it in a way that people can understand what it means. For example, one of the things that I often find myself looking for is, so what, we had X number of billions of dollars of sales tax revenue this quarter. If you don't know what it was last quarter, if you don't know what we expected it to be, because remember, the Comptroller estimates the revenue for the state of Texas. The Comptroller says, given our local tax structure, given our local fee structure, given the economy, this is how much money should come in. So when you go to that transparency site and you see how much money came in, that's not very useful data unless you know how much money we thought was going to come in, unless you knew how much money came in at that time the prior year. How much did we predict was going to come in? Where are we on target? So we've got a lot of work to do in that regard, but the debt situation, in addition to making sure the public is aware of it, we've got to understand the underlying causes for that, and I believe it's a fundamentally flawed tax structure. Tax is not punishment. Should not be punishment. It's used in Texas like a carrot and stick, but it really ought to be a fair share of the cost of local government. And when the cost of local government cannot be met with current tax revenue, when we're putting all of those costs onto a credit card, when we've got debt that's going through the ceiling, it's a very strong indicator that that system is broken. And we've got to have leadership, not just reactionary political officials, but ones that will lead, that will look at where we are, what's the underlying cause to the difficulties that we're facing, and find real solutions.
There have been calls for the Comptroller's office to perform a new study on the economic impact of illegal immigration in Texas. Do you support performing this new study, and do you think it would significantly affect the immigration reform debate?
Yeah, Julian Aguilar with Texas Tribune wrote about that recently, and I said then, I don't think there's any question we need to know. I mentioned earlier in this interview the importance of these dynamic economic impact studies, not just the numbers, but what do they mean beyond the immediate revenue impact. The thing that study pointed out was the effect on state government, but it didn't really look at the impact on local governments. It alluded to that it was probably a more devastating impact, a greater impact on local government. We certainly need to redo that study. It's old. We need new data there. But beyond that, I think it's real important to not let the economic impact dictate policy, or let the economic impact alone dictate policy. I'm a little bit concerned that we're moving to a place where we say, oh, well, if we find out that there's a positive economic impact, the illegal immigration is okay. No, it's not. And I think we have to be real careful that we understand, while we need to know what the economic impact is, that alone is not what determines the rule of law and what's good law and what's just law. And the law needs to be enforced irregardless of what we see that economic impact is, and not be enforced solely because there's a huge cost associated with it, or not enforced because there's a great positive revenue impact from it.
Well, thank you for joining us today. How can people find out more about your campaign?
Boy, we are active all around the state, but really have a presence in social media. I hope folks will follow me on Twitter at Debra Medina. And then both the campaign website and the Facebook site are medinafortexas.com. I'm going to be doing a lot of traveling between now and the election, and our team is working all around the state, so I hope we'll see people out on the campaign trail.
Well, thank you, and best of luck to you.
Thank you very much.